Welcome to Nocturnal Ledger. There are stories that we tell ourselves in the dark to simulate fear, to feel that quickening of the pulse that reminds us we are alive, safe within the confines of our locked doors. Then, there are the stories that refuse to remain stories. These are the accounts that bleed into reality, the documented events that stain police records and traumatize entire communities. We often turn to Hollywood for our horror, seeking the thrill of a jump scare or an orchestrated crescendo of violins. But the truth is often far more insidious, far more enduring, and infinitely more terrifying than any scriptwriter could invent. You may know the story of the Perron family through the lens of modern cinema, specifically the film The Conjuring, but the cinematic adaptation was merely a sanitized fragment of a decade-long ordeal that defies rational explanation. This is not a movie. This is a forensic examination of a 10-year siege upon a family who bought a farmhouse in Rhode Island, only to find that they were trespassing on ground that had been claimed by the dead for centuries. This is the true, unvarnished, and harrowing account of the haunting of the Arnold Estate. To understand the horror that befell the Perron family, we must first strip away the comfort of skepticism and look at the cold, hard facts of the location itself. In the winter of 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perron purchased a sprawling 14-room farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. It was known as the Old Arnold Estate, located at 1677 Round Top Road. On paper, it was the American dream personified. A colonial farmhouse built in 1736, sitting on 200 acres of pristine land. It was the perfect place to raise their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April. But the dream began to curdle before they even unpacked the first box. The first documented anomaly is not a ghost, but a warning. When the Perrons bought the property, the previous sellers did not offer a warm welcome or advice on the boiler.
As they were handing over the keys, the man looked at Roger Perron with a gravity that bordered on desperation and offered a single piece of advice. He said, "For the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night." Roger, a pragmatic man, dismissed this as rural eccentricity. He would soon learn that this was a survival strategy.
The history of the Arnold Estate was not something disclosed in the real estate listing. It was a history written in blood, agony, and frozen despair. Subsequent research by the family and paranormal investigators revealed that over the course of 8 generations, the property had been the site of a staggering number of tragedies. The public records of the town of Burrillville held the grim accounting. There were 2 documented suicides by hanging in the attic. There was a suicide by poison. The rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl named Prudence Arnold. 2 drownings in the nearby creek. And perhaps most chillingly, 4 men who mysteriously froze to death on the land, despite being relatively close to the house. The soil itself was saturated with trauma. The haunting did not begin with a crescendo. It began with an invasion of the senses. It started the very day they moved in. The family reported an immediate, overwhelming sense of being watched. This wasn't just a feeling of unease. It was a biological reaction, the primal instinct of prey, realizing a predator is in the tall grass. The first entity they encountered was relatively benign, a spirit the children eventually named Manny. Manny was described as a sorrowful figure who would stand and watch the children play. He often appeared as a physical solidity, blocking out the light, only to fade away if eye contact was made. But Manny was the exception. He was the calm before the storm. As the weeks turned into months, the activity escalated from passive observation to aggressive interaction. The girls, particularly the younger ones, began to report whispers in the night. These weren't vague noises. They were distinct voices carrying on conversations in archaic dialects. Cindy, one of the middle children, described hearing a repeated, rhythmic scraping sound in the walls, like something trying to claw its way out of the plaster. But the true terror of the Arnold Estate was not auditory. It was olfactory. The family began to smell distinct, overpowering odors that had no physical source. Sometimes it was the scent of flowers, fleeting and sweet. But more often, it was the smell of rotting flesh, a putrid, sulfurous stench that would fill a room instantly, inducing gagging and nausea, only to vanish seconds later. This phenomenon, known in parapsychology as phantasmia, is often associated with demonic or negative inhuman infestations. The house was breathing its history onto them. The entity that would come to define their nightmare, the dark heart of the haunting, was a presence the family came to know as Bathsheba. History tells us that Bathsheba Sherman was a real woman who lived on the neighboring farm in the mid-19th century. Local folklore, which the Perrons eventually uncovered through whisper networks and library archives, painted her as a woman shrouded in darkness. She was rumored to be a Satanist, accused of sacrificing an infant in her care by piercing the base of the child's skull with a knitting needle. Although she was legally cleared of the crime due to lack of evidence, the community branded her a witch. She reportedly died a bitter, angry woman in 1885, her body turning to stone, a form of paralysis, before she passed. Whether the spirit in the house was truly the soul of Bathsheba Sherman or a demonic entity wearing her face is a matter of debate among demonologists. What is not up for debate is the violence she inflicted upon Carolyn Perron. This entity targeted the mother specifically. It was a jealous, territorial hatred. Carolyn would wake up with distinct pinch marks on her skin, bruises that formed perfect concentric circles, and lacerations that looked like she had been raked by claws. One of the most chilling aspects of this haunting was the physical manipulation of the environment. Objects didn't just fall, they were thrown. Doors didn't just creak, they slammed shut with enough force to shake the foundation, then locked themselves from the inside. Roger Perron, a skeptic who tried desperately to find rational explanations for the sake of his sanity, would drag the heavy basement door shut and lock it, only to watch the latch turn by itself and the door swing open into the darkness of the cellar. The basement was the heart of the house's coldness. Even in the height of summer, the temperature in the cellar would plummet to freezing, a phenomenon witnessed by heating repairmen who refused to work in the house. The psychological toll on the children was immense. Andrea Perron, the eldest daughter who later chronicled the events in her memoirs, described living in a state of constant, high-alert terror. They learned to sleep with the covers pulled over their heads, terrified to look at the darkness of their bedrooms. They reported seeing apparitions of a woman with a gray, desiccated face and a neck that appeared broken, leaning over their beds, whispering threats. Specifically, the entity would whisper, "Get out, or I will drive you out with death and gloom." It is crucial to understand that the Perrons were not hallucinating in isolation. They had witnesses. Neighbors, contractors, and visiting relatives all experienced the phenomena. A family friend who came to stay for a weekend fled in the middle of the night after hearing a disembodied voice scream her name directly into her ear. The family dog, a creature of pure instinct, refused to enter the house upon their arrival and barked incessantly at the empty air until, days later, he was found dead in the backyard, his body intact but his face frozen in a rictus of sheer terror. As the activity became violent, threatening the physical safety of the children, the family sought help. This is where the famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren entered the narrative. It was 1974. The Warrens were not the polished heroes of the cinema. They were controversial figures, often criticized, but deeply committed to their work. When Lorraine Warren, a trance medium, stepped into the Arnold Estate, she was immediately assaulted by the psychic weight of the house. She confirmed that the property was infested not just with human spirits, but with something inhuman. The investigation by the Warrens culminated in a séance that remains one of the most controversial and terrifying events in paranormal history. The goal was to communicate with the spirits to understand their intent. But the ritual went horribly wrong. According to the eyewitness testimony of Andrea Perron, who was watching from a crack in the door, her mother, Carolyn, became possessed. This was not the theatrics of a movie. This was a biological impossibility. Carolyn, a small woman, was thrown across the room by an invisible force. Her voice changed, dropping an octave and speaking in a guttural language that no one in the room understood. Her body contorted in ways that defied anatomy. Roger Perron, watching his wife being tortured by unseen forces, demanded that the séance stop. He physically intervened, throwing Ed Warren out of the way to get to his wife. The scene was chaotic, violent, and deeply traumatic. Contrary to the film, the Warrens did not successfully exorcise the house. In fact, Roger Perron, terrified that the investigators were only making the entities angrier, kicked them out. He ordered them to leave the property and never return. The family was left alone again, trapped in the house with an evil that was now agitated and more active than ever. You might ask, why did they stay? Why would any parent keep their children in a house of horrors? The answer is the most terrifying reality of all: poverty. The Perrons had sunk every penny they had into the property. They were financially ruined. The economy of the 1970s was brutal, and they could not sell the house. Who would buy a house where the walls bled and the screams of children echoed at night? They were hostages in their own home. They stayed in that house for 10 long years. 10 years of sleeping with the lights on. 10 years of waking up to bruises. 10 years of living alongside the dead. The haunting became a mundane part of their existence, a twisted new normal. The girls learned which rooms to avoid. They learned to ignore the banging in the pipes. They learned to coexist with the spirits that were less malevolent. They spoke of a spirit that smelled of pipe tobacco, who would clean up the kitchen, sweeping dirt into a pile in the center of the floor. They spoke of the spirit of a little boy who just wanted to play with their toy cars. It was a house of madness, a kaleidoscope of the afterlife, where the veil between the living and the dead had been shredded. The scientific community has attempted to debunk the Perron haunting for decades. Skeptics point to carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace to explain the hallucinations. They cite the stress of financial ruin as a cause for mass hysteria. They argue that the folklore of Bathsheba Sherman was largely invented or exaggerated. And yet, these explanations fail to account for the physical evidence. They cannot explain the levitation of objects witnessed by independent third parties. They cannot explain the physical injuries on Carolyn Perron's body that were documented by doctors. They cannot explain how 5 separate children, along with their parents and visitors, all shared the exact same hallucinations at the exact same times, often describing the entities in identical detail without consulting one another. One particular event stands out in the records of the haunting, a moment that solidified the reality of the situation for the skeptics in the family. It was a winter night, and the heating system had failed again. Roger went to the basement to fix it. As he was working, he felt a cold hand touch his back. He turned, expecting to see Carolyn, but the cellar was empty. Then he saw it. A scythe, an old rusty farming tool that had been hanging on the wall, began to levitate. It floated off its hook and hung in the air, aimed directly at him. Then, with violent force, it was hurled across the room, embedding itself deep into the wooden beam next to his head. This was not a draft. This was not hysteria. This was an attempted murder by an unseen assailant. The family finally managed to leave the Arnold Estate in 1980. They moved to Georgia, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Rhode Island. But the trauma did not end when they crossed the state line. The psychological scars ran deep. The girls, now women, have spent their lives trying to process the decade of terror. Andrea Perron has written multiple volumes documenting the haunting, stating that she felt it was her duty to tell the truth, not to frighten, but to validate the existence of the supernatural. The house itself still stands. It has changed hands several times since the Perrons left. Subsequent owners have reported strange activity, though perhaps not to the same violent degree as the Perrons experienced. It seems the storm centered specifically on that family, or perhaps specifically on Carolyn. Recent investigations by paranormal groups continue to capture electronic voice phenomena and unexplained thermal anomalies on the property. The current owners have even opened it up for tours, turning the site of a family's torture into a destination for thrill seekers. But let us return to the core of this tragedy. The Perron family haunting forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of our reality. We like to believe that we are the masters of our domain, that if we pay the mortgage and lock the doors, we are safe. But the story of the Arnold Estate suggests that land holds memory. It suggests that intense emotion, trauma, and violence can imprint themselves onto the physical world, creating a loop of suffering that can entrap the living. The entity known as Bathsheba, whether she was a witch or misunderstood woman, represents the enduring power of hatred. Her spirit, or the demonic force mimicking her, was defined by a refusal to let go, a refusal to cede control of the land she believed was hers. It is a terrifying thought that death is not an exit, but merely a change in state, and that the worst parts of a human personality, the rage, the jealousy, the cruelty, can survive the decay of the body and fester in the dark corners of a house. As we analyze the documented evidence, the police reports of disturbances, the medical records of Carolyn's injuries, the testimony of the Warrens, and the unwavering accounts of the 5 Perron daughters, we are left with a preponderance of proof that points to one conclusion. Something walked the halls of the Arnold Estate. Something that hated the living. The Perron family survived, but they did not escape unscathed. They carry the darkness of Harrisville with them. It is in the way they check the locks twice. It is in the way they hesitate before entering a dark room. It is in the silence that falls over them when the wind howls in a certain way. So tonight, as you lay in your bed, listening to the settling of your own house, ask yourself, is that creak just the wood expanding in the heat? Is that cold draft just a gap in the window insulation? Or are you, like the Perrons, merely tenants in a property that has already been claimed by something else? The lights may be on, but the shadows are always waiting. The ledger of the night is never truly closed. This has been a file from the Nocturnal Ledger. Sleep well, if you can.